Thank you so much. I have to say not only Amen, I have to repeat the blessing, Shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh, because it's a great privilege to be here. In fact, it's such a great privilege that it's very difficult for me to stay on script in terms of thinking about what I should say. I'm feeling so overwhelmed for many reasons. Firstly, that people virtually on the eve of Thanksgiving, and people, particularly students who aren't from here, are postponing their Thanksgiving plans to be here on this inconvenient day. My apologies for that, and as I suggested to some students, if your parents are anxious about whether you're going to make it home on time or if you've really had to change them, take it from a new grandfather that it's not a slippery slope, that it may be that even if you miss a Thanksgiving or two, you well may be back a few years from now as adults with your parents, and they shouldn't be too anxious. But I really appreciate your being here with me on this inconvenient day. It's also overwhelming, the environment. Firstly, just this beautiful building. I love recycled buildings. The thought that this is a railroad station. I have special fondness for railroad stations. It reminds me of my electric trains and all that I want to do with my grandchildren, and I've already gotten some ideas of just the layout of this building. But more than that, there's a generational connection here, and in fact, your Dean Rutherford, had the good sense of changing my first proposal of a topic which had something to do about baby boomers and track 1.5 diplomacy to something that was a little bit more respectable in terms of diplomacy and conflict resolution. But I have to say that I feel a very special connection to the Clintons, plural, and to their careers and their trajectories, and President Clinton now and his involvement in what might be considered civil society, strengthening civil society, development, social cohesion, and the like. I, from sort of the same generation, look with great respect to the careers that both Clintons have built, and it's an inspiration for me to add to the discourse that takes place around this building. It's also a distinct pleasure for me to be, get this, in the South. I do cross the Mason-Dixon line every once in a while when I go to Washington, go to Arlington or something like that, but this really is the South. And I think that there's something very special about North-South relations that we have been overlooking. And a commemoration is coming up that very much weighs on me. One of my board members is the Venerable Don Shriver, the great Protestant theologian, former president of Union Theological Seminary, who's written the most important works on conciliation from a social science as well as a theological perspective. And our involvement in dialogue has gone on for many years. And he has often said to me, the Civil War really isn't over. And a lot of the things that have happened are happening in America, and this was before the Tea Party and before all sorts of things, has to do with the fact that hasn't been resolved, and someday we have to deal with the issues. And as I come here, I realize that commemoration is coming up, and perhaps there are new opportunities for the North and South to be involved in dialogue, for whites and African Americans, for at this time after the notion that not all justice happens in courtrooms, that there are transitional justices for a new kind of dialogue in the wake of the successes of South Africa, the unresolved, the intractable conflicts of the Middle East and other places, the successful resolutions of conflicts and the not so successful, for the North and South to be an important dialogue. We were talking before about recent discoveries on the history of this conflict. We thought we knew all about the Civil War, and now there's some new data, new material in this excellent historiography that, in fact, there were more northern slaveholders than we've estimated. And this presents enormously exciting possibilities, so that I hope that you people really at the spearhead of issues of conciliation, issues of civil society, will really take an initiative in this and set an example for other places in the world that are stuck in their dialogue. Some of the things that already have happened in the South of conciliation, the lynchings in local communities have been dealt with in very sensitive and wonderful ways, and we don't even know very much about it. So it's all the more urgent that I be here and learn from you as much as I can share anything. And therefore, I'm not going to speak too long so that I have that opportunity to talk and to hear from you. One of the most abused words in the English language is the word abused itself. There is, for some reason, and even in America, with its tradition of mobility and Horatio Alger and people getting ahead, some new sense of, we are the underdogs. We are the victims. A new pride in showing our wounds rather than showing our strengths and showing our potential. And indeed, there are many people who have been wounded, but often the way in which the word abused is used really trivializes the whole matter and points to the importance of us being careful about language. I would have said until recently, though, that the most trivialized and abused word in the English language is the very concept, I'm sorry, or forgiveness. Please forgive me. The whole sorry, forgiveness connection. How many times has it happened to you that you've complained on the telephone to T-Mobile or Verizon that your telephone bill has been, calculated incorrectly, and the answer generally scripted, and it's not clear whether it's local headquarters or outsourced to Bangalore to poor Indians who've been forced to speak English with Bostonian accents, is sorry, you go to Siberia. Sorry, it doesn't matter. So we are very much a society that's interested in conciliation, interested in, sorry, forgiveness, and yet these are words that are attached to impotence rather than to doing something about it. And I must say I go ballistic when I hear that. And I'm simply not capable of hearing this kind of violation of language. What do you mean you're sorry? If you're sorry, you should do something about it. Don't tell me you're sorry. So all these things work against serious people and the kind of students that are in this school who are prepared to commit their lives to the independent sector, a sector which is not established based on its power other than communication, other than representation, other than values, and are prepared to evoke these things as levers, as instruments. What should be the instruments for clearing up messes like this if our language is being violated all over the place? What I'd like to do is present a case study for you. Some experiences that I've had in working with some place between diplomacy and conflict resolution, simply to give us some data to talk about, point to the equivocal situations that one slips into in this field, talk a little bit about my own organization, both as an educational organization, what our methodologies of education are, but also the substantive dimensions. What is different about the way in which we do conciliation than many worthwhile organizations? What are we emphasizing that we feel is really important to bring people together, particularly where it's not clear who the victim is and who the victimizer is? There are so many situations where it just isn't clear. We sort of have nostalgia for those bad old conflicts where, there were really good guys and bad guys. But there are a lot more conflicts where it's not clear. And there are also a lot more conflicts where our information comes from transmitted sources, where it's not our memory. It's not, I went out there and I got beaten up, or I was a part of some terrible situation, or I was in 1948 when the Israelis took away my homes, or I was in the Holocaust, or I was in an Arab riot. There are so many situations where we're dealing with transmitted memory, second and third generation memory. Our general instinct is, well, bygones are bygones. The longer, the farther back it is, the less clearly we remember it, and that turns out to be absolutely wrong. It is often the case that second and third generation people feel the violation with even a greater vehemence because they heard it from their grandmother, they heard it from their grandfather, and they remember what people who they loved talked about it. So they experience it both as information, but also as a relationship. What kind of tools can we use in trying to conciliate in situations involving transmitted memory? What are the problems, the disparities between memory and history? I bring to situations like this my favorite prop for show and tell. This is a book that has given me great inspiration at moments of despair. The title is Historians' Fallacies. And what it is about it's about 3,000 examples of common inferences from history that are altogether wrong, the kind of mistakes that professional historians make in trying to assess the past. Well, Lord of the universe, if professional historians are making these mistakes about history, how can we ordinary people understand this? I will pass this around for show and tell, but please return it. It's out of print and it's hard to find copies. How can we learn anything from the past? Maybe we should just say, let bygones be bygones. Let's move ahead. And indeed, there are many people who would say, let bygones be bygones. There are, for example, leaders in places like Cambodia who want to deal with the genocide by saying, let's dig a big hole and let's bury that history and let's just forget about this. And that seems like an attractive alternative to letting history fester and living with these memories. And there are, of course, whole societies. Some of the dystopia literature, some of the literatures about 1884, about societies that are thought to be ideal but turn out to be nightmares. One of the things that they do is that they sort of outlaw history. Maybe it would be good, maybe forgetfulness is not such a bad thing. Maybe, it all ends in Alzheimer's anyhow, so we should make the best of it. Why deal with all this stuff? And yet, we have come to the conclusion that bygones cannot be bygones, that unless we deal with the past, unless we have some dialogue about it, unless we understand how it has influenced us, we're always going to get drawn down. Here I must recall an important statement of Yes, a Southern writer, William Faulkner, who talked about this, and I also must confess that I distorted his statement, that it makes my visit here all the more important. When we were setting up an organization, we needed a logo. I came across William Faulkner's statement, the past is not the past, the past isn't gone, it hasn't even begun, or something like that. And I left out 3 words. He said, in the South. In the South, the past has, but I could say in the North also. People are going to live with memories, whether they are accurate by the 2,000 or 3,000 standards of distortions of Professor Fisher or not, and unless we peacemakers, unless we members of civil society who want to bring together people from different factions and say, let's not persevere with this, let's try to understand it, let's take our pained memory and make something beautiful out of it. Let's make empathy out of it. Let's understand each other. Let's put ourselves in each other's shoes. Unless we can do that, we're all going to be crippled. I'd like to share with you an experience of just a few weeks ago. I was in China with a group of largely Christian evangelical leaders from Western Europe, meaning and the United States and Canada, England, Britain, France, Holland, Germany, as well as some Japanese leaders, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the destruction of the Summer Palace and the Opium War. This in China is seen as the example, par excellence, of the West humiliating Chinese, and this is taught both in schools, parents to children. Remember, never trust people from the West. This is what they do to us, and is a major cause for anti-Western sentiment. It is based on something very, very odious. It is based on an incident, a confrontation over the West peddling opium in China, not being satisfied with selling opium at the ports, but wanting with their black ships to be able to get to the inner areas, along with other things that they were trying to force China to open to, and selling opium, which essentially created addiction among hundreds of millions of people. And when there was some resistance to this, the British primarily burnt down the Summer Palace of the last emperor, and in retribution to the fact that a diplomatic delegation trying to convince the Chinese to allow these black ships in were tortured to death. It's a very equivocal story. It's not just Chinese against foreigners, because clearly the people who were going to peddle the opium were also Chinese. The emperor did not act with deliberate leadership. His one summer palace was destroyed, plundered. Its booty was taken to great museums all over the world and to Queen Victoria. 2 lions are in the building next to mine at Harvard University to this very day, and I don't think I could convince the administration of Harvard to return it in any conciliatory gesture. Those lions are ours. In fact, even the case of the Elgin marbles is mooted, because it was the son of Lord Elgin who was involved in the destruction of the palace. So it's equivocal. It's even more equivocal if you grind some numbers and figure out what the economics of this whole thing were, which unfortunately I did, and got me terribly, terribly depressed. What's it about? It turns out that the colonial model of trade with the Chinese, we bring them stuff like steel from Manchester, and they sell us stuff like spices from, was off by 5%. There was a bookkeeping error, and the interest of the Chinese in steel was 5% less than the interest of Queen Victoria and the heirs of that fortune going to Victoria's Secret in spices and the like. Well, 5% bookkeeping account has to be rectified. Well, the British at the same point had conquered India, and there was a lot of opium there, and they said, well, let's peddle some opium through some Chinese agents in China, and there was some resistance to that, and that's what provokes the whole thing. So it was addiction. Addiction not as a psychological factor. It wasn't that the Chinese were down and out necessarily. It was the political and economic use of addiction, as we find in lots of places. That was the basis of this horrible conflict that leads to humiliation, that leads to the backwardness of China correctly perceived, that leads to all the movements to change this, including the communist movement and everything that led to. And now my good friends, Christian missionaries with good intentions, want to do something about it, want to use this opportunity to express their regret. And for me to be the spokesperson to talk about how it's not good to raise generations of young people feeling that they were humiliated and that the whole world is against them and that they're perennial victims and maybe there's a better way of dealing with it. The more candid of these missionaries would also say to me things like, well, China is the greatest market for conversion. And, if we get rid of this anti-Western stuff, we'll have a freeway to conversions. I, as a person who generally does not believe in missionary work, but I also, as a Jew who, could not necessarily support this, felt that I couldn't really be associated with that part of the effort. And therefore, I could not convince my organization as an NGO to take this on as an effort in conciliation. I did feel that there was something to be said about peacemaking and reducing this kind of tension, and so I agreed as an individual to be involved. I changed my mind shortly before this for two reasons. Now this is part of the case study that I'm putting on the table. One reason was that the Pew Foundation in Washington early summer released a report about how Christianity was penetrating China to a larger extent than anyone had imagined, including the missionaries, so that the missionaries were really not contributing that much to converting the Chinese. There were 100 million Chinese in the church, the legal church, which is a church that's controlled by the government. There's a gray church, then there's an underground church, and proportions were already headed in the direction of Korea, which is about 40 to 60%. So I thought, well, Geronimo, it's not going to make any difference, so maybe I can associate. But I also had another reason for changing my mind. I was skeptical about this effort because I felt that my colleagues had intentions that were not germane to the particular process. That wasn't just peacemaking, they had their own. I suddenly realized that I had such motives also. They wanted to talk about Christianity, I wanted to talk about Tibet. I wanted to talk about Chinese involvement in Africa, their development scheme. What I wanted to say to the Chinese was, we can acknowledge you as bona fide victims. You have been victimized, but let us look at victims as a population to unite with other victims. Victims of the world unite. And under any circumstance, a license as victims or the acknowledgement of victimhood is not a license to victimize other people. And if you want to be accepted in the larger community, that you have to look at things like human rights and other issues that are emerging and try to adjust your own policies. That's what I wanted to talk about. And that's perhaps not directly related to the conciliation also. And so I felt more at one with my colleagues, and I felt that this was an equivocal situation, but in any event, we had to try to develop a language with our Chinese colleagues to deal with these issues. What happened after lots of things, and including lots of bad things, because the Chinese reacted very strongly to the fact that a dissident had received the Nobel Prize and began to cancel all kinds of things, and it was really quite out of hand, was that I suddenly realized with some of my colleagues that what we were talking about was really a downturn in colonialism. We were talking about 1860 as a point where colonialism had gotten to a certain point and then was really degenerating. But at the same time, 1860, if you just look at that number, what else happens in 1860? 1860 is when Florence Nightingale gets active. The 1860s is the period where international humanitarian law develops in Western Europe. The serfs in Russia, the Emperor of Russia was one of the participants of this. The serfs in Russia were emancipated. How does it happen that at the same time that a kind of humanitarianism is developing, such that historians talk about the last part of the 19th century as a period of a kind of humanizing? There's a historian and sociologist by the name of Norbert Ellis who talks about manners and humanization processes developing in Europe. The period of 1860 to World War I is one of the most pacific periods in European history. It's precisely at this moment that the West becomes so brutal towards East Asia and South Asia. What is this all about? What does this imply? That somehow we establish the parameters of moral concern in one place, and at the same time we allow ourselves to destroy hundreds of millions of people by peddling opium and other addictives. And that's what's called colonialism. Lots of people study colonialism. There's post-colonial studies. But are we really taking some of the early warning signals of colonialism to understand other global movements, like, for example, globalism? We are now looking at new networks that are developing between countries, not so much state to state as in the period of colonialism. Are we taking the early warning signals of what happens in these situations to heart when we assess globalism and when we assess the new world order that is emerging right now? That globalism is based more on identity issues, on to some extent civil society issues. In this new global world, it will happen that people who are interested in music will have better connections with people who have interest in music all over the world. Yo-Yo Ma has established a great organization for the music of the silk trade, to understand the music that develops on borders. What a wonderful project! What a wonderful endeavor! There will be all kinds of connections in this new web of group relations, and yet could it be that hidden someplace in this model of globalism, there are new addictions that are going to be peddled, not necessarily by the voluntary sector, not necessarily by the independent sector, not necessarily by governments, perhaps by the corporate world. There's a big debate about money, about the value of the Chinese yuan and what that's doing to international trade. Are there early warning signals that we have to see in colonialism that we have to apply to the new situation? This is what I learned from this experience, that somehow the important thing in these conciliations is not only that we shake hands, that we examine our pained memory, but that we learn lessons from the past that can be applicable to the future. Where this will go, where this discourse will go, remains to be seen. It's still fairly marginal in terms of China. There are more people becoming interested in this, but these are the kind of issues that we try to deal with in examining the pained memory, the transmitted memory, and looking at early warning signals for the new situation. How does this have to do with the network of institutions that are involved in international affairs? What does it have to do with diplomacy? And what does it have to do with the opportunities of people that are being trained in this building, in voluntary sector, in mobilizing philanthropic sentiments, good sentiments of Americans and other people, to be benevolent, to feel a degree of social cohesion, to develop projects that will have an impact on the rate of development in different countries. What are some of our instruments? We know that diplomacy is a well-established institution in every government. The range of activities are from what diplomats do in foreign ministries. They pale off into spying, because often diplomats are spies, either because they're looking at things that their host governments don't want them to look at, or because governments that send them use foreign ministries as a place to locate spies. There's a whole new sector that has developed in the volunteer sector that has to do with NGOs and international agencies that are somewhat representative, where national loyalties are not supposed to be the paramount concern. What are NGOs doing in terms of governments and values and the like? It seems to me that to some extent what we now call track 2 diplomacy, that is, if the government isn't doing it, let us people get together and set up an agency for philanthropy or an agency for spreading this attitude or that attitude. Track 2 diplomacy often develops in response to government deficiencies or disagreement with policy. In democratic governments, you can do what you want to do, and why not privatize foreign relations? If you have advocacy in domestic issues, why can't there be advocacy in foreign issues? There are limits to this, perhaps. There's a lot in constitutional law that has to do between state law and federal law, that federal law really controls foreign relations. So when, for example, my state, the good Commonwealth of Massachusetts, decides that it doesn't want to support the Burmese government and tries to take its own sanctions and even uses indirect methods by saying pension funds will not be invested in funds that help the Burmese government, this becomes a constitutional issue. But still, there is an area that we might call track 1.5 that is between the track 1, which is government, and track 2. I think that some of us in recent years, myself included, feel that a lot of track 2 has developed too much in reaction to governments. Too many of us baby boomers, children of the 60s, have been active with sort of negative attitudes towards government, and that there should be some reconciliation in the process. So, for example, when I thought that it was a good idea to go to China, I always consult the State Department. The State Department, the China desk doesn't necessarily say, yeah, that's a great idea, we're going to pay for your ticket, though sometimes they do. And sometimes if I go, I have to be very open about it, that I'm being sent by the State Department, even though I'm not necessarily controlled by any specific policy. But that's a legitimate thing in relation to what could be, as long as there is openness about it. I, for example, at a certain point, was offered a position with the CIA in the 1980s. I'm not ashamed of this, though I'm not sure I would speak at Harvard and Boston University with as much assurance that no one would shout me down as I do in this audience. It seemed to me to be a legitimate way of servicing my government. And suddenly I found that, to be a social scientist in the CIA, well, firstly, it's a little bit awkward. You don't go to professional organizations, and you get information and you don't give off information. And that I was going to be pretty isolated. But I said, okay, this is, I couldn't go into the Vietnam War. This wasn't my war. I didn't agree with my government. Here's an opportunity to serve, and I was very enthusiastic about it. I was in the peculiar situation that I was already working for the government, and so it turned out, because I was GS whatever, I had to take an administrative position, and rather than just a substantive, because GS, 18s cannot just be. So I suddenly found that if I was going to take this position, I would be in charge of a division or something. Okay, I can deal with this. But suddenly, when I realized that, among other things, because of what I told my colleagues and also because of the security investigation, it was discovered that I had been to Poland a lot as a scholar, and I had been studying, guess what? Vodka. I came to China with a measure of expertise on addiction, on how vodka was used as an instrument of economic and political control. And one of my tasks would be to go to Poland again and find out about the Free University and about solidarity, which I had lectured for, and I had thought this is a great development, and we all agreed it was a great development. It was just that suddenly I was being sent heretofore as a journalist and scholar, and now I would be the CIA, and I had to say to my colleagues, I'm sorry, I can't do this because my role as an individual would conflict with the way I was being perceived. I certainly couldn't tell people that I was doing this. It would endanger other scholars and other journalists. It would endanger a whole provision that, that certain people were allowed into countries like that. And I found that my services to the CIA were not as much invited under those circumstances. And I had to withdraw. So, in this kind of arrangement of what is diplomacy, yes, we can be public diplomats. Yes, we can be diplomats in the Foreign Service. Yes, we can be in intelligence agencies. But I think that ultimately we have to not only follow rules, but in some of the gray areas, we have to figure out what the rules are. There are Chatham House rules for the way in which one can report about certain conversations without direct attribution, and they work in certain situations, but still our moral sense of how we might endanger people is very, very serious. The track 1.5 diplomacy, which I espouse, involves cooperation with government, but as an individual and taking direct responsibility. And it seems to me that this is a path for many people in the independent sector to consider, and that some of the antagonisms, say, of former diplomats who have defected from, who worked with Kissinger and found it untenable and then decided they're going to accomplish more. Great people like Harold Sanders, who had wonderful careers ahead of themselves, but just did not want to compromise, and then got involved in public diplomacy, citizen-to-citizen diplomacy. All this is very possible and very important for the independent sector. So I think we have an array of ways in which local people can serve global causes, and I'm very happy that at this school there are people who are thinking about that in very serious terms. There are two more points that I would like to make about these possibilities. One is that in trying to be peacemakers, that indeed interests are not the only issue that one has to deal with, that pained memory is an important issue, and this is something that my NGO pays careful attention to. That in any kind of issue that involves identity, that we have to look at pained memory as part of what people come to conflicts with, as the reservoir of hatred, and that which ultimately undermines any kind of agreement. And if one looks at ongoing conflicts like the Middle Eastern conflict, it's because some of the diplomats, some of the government people simply felt that the past was just so untenable that we can't deal with it. If everyone's going to be thinking about what happened in 1948, it's so equivocal, it's not going to be settled, so let's forget about it. Let's just talk about the money, let's talk about where the borders are. That simply does not work. Unless there's some effort to create a culture of peace, which involves dealing with these situations, it's just not going to work. When we did the first negotiations in 1970, it was clearly the rule, anytime an Israeli starts talking about 1948, anytime a Palestinian starts talking about 1948, you stop them. If that means telling them to eat more couscous, because the wife of our professor who planned these things was a wonderful cook, and she thought couscous was the right food for mediation. If it means eating more couscous, stuffing their mouths with couscous, great. You cannot allow people to talk about the past. It doesn't work. How do people talk about the past? These are some of the methods that we have tried to develop. It involves essentially looking at the way in which the big history goes through the lives of little people. What do you remember about 1948? How interesting, your grandfather sounds like my grandmother. One thing we can be sure of when we bring people together in protracted conflicts like this is that at the moment of them coming together, they're all thinking the same thing. The Israeli Jews are thinking, if my grandfather of blessed memory knew that I was sitting with an Arab, he would turn over in his grave. And the Arab is thinking, if my grandmother of blessed memory knew that I was talking to a Zionist, she would turn over in the grave. So immediately there's empathy. They're thinking the same things. And if we can intuit that, we can build on that. That's essential to our methods. We get people to talk about their stereotypes. We get them, to dump it. As we develop the group dynamic and make them realize that they can sit next to each other, and they reach a certain point in that, we then do the shocking thing of saying Arabs to the right, Jews to the left, which gets everyone very frightened. And we develop caucus situations in which people examine their stereotypes about their fears, their pains, their concerns, their hopes, their sense of trust, what would give them. And they exchange this and they examine it. And then we teach them how to develop empathetic discussions, how to strengthen each other. And we pair up a Jew and an Arab. And one talks about his or her family going back several generations. And there's an exercise for each one to identify with the other. And we reverse this. These are the kind of things that we try to do to get at this pained memory, to drain this hatred, to create a situation where people can really talk to each other and envision a culture of peace. We do another thing. We don't allow our mediations to end with dealing with feelings and good intentions, even if they're in dialogue for a month or for a year. Part of the process is to get them to work on projects together. Okay, you see some common interests, translate this into a work project. You want to talk about zoning in your neighborhood. You want to talk about, wouldn't it be nice to have a community center? You want to bring your children together for a feast. These efforts have to lead to concrete action, and we try to develop these concrete actions in more and more complex ways. What we're doing, we feel, is really important to other areas of conflict resolution. We're particularly concerned with the fact that so much that goes on in development does not also take into consideration social cohesion. That billions of dollars can be invested in building in Bosnia new infrastructure, new sewerage systems that were blown up in the last war. And that's very important. But if the peace model is a soldier behind every tree, and you're going to leave it at that, you're not going to get very far, because when you decide that it maybe should be a soldier behind every other tree, or maybe a police person behind every other tree, and the security issue is at risk, if you haven't built a measure of social cohesion, if you haven't gotten those Muslims and Christians to talk to each other, those Serbs and those Croats who harbor ancient resentments and don't even know what the resentments were about, but those resentments are strong enough to wreck married couples and families and the like, if you don't penetrate those things, nothing good is going to happen. And yet, our development organizations are investing billions and billions of dollars. Major institutions are doing this. It may be our fault, because we have not gotten to the point where I can say, we have this process, we've evaluated it, we know that this is what is going to develop social cohesion. If you get people to talk about their pain memories, they are really going to be able to work together. We're working on it, but we haven't gotten to the point. It's much easier to bring the heavy equipment on the ground and to start digging the new infrastructure than to deal with this kind of human infrastructure. But as every agency, and I've interviewed people in many agencies who are involved in these kind of things, will tell me, yeah, it catches up with us. We have the heavy equipment out there, and all of a sudden there's this group or that group that's saying, we don't want this dam, we don't want this project. It's good for those people, it's not good for us. And there's no forethought, there's no effort to bring communities together to say, let us build a dam together. These are the benefits for you, these are the benefits for us. So here, we, the international community, the international agencies that are not necessarily being regulated by governments and parliaments, we are not contributing as much as we should be to what can be peace, and we're just adding to the sense of frustration that this conflict is intractable, that conflict is intractable. And yet, when we look under the surface, we see really devoted people on all sides of conflicts building the foundations, building the bases of pluralism that we are not looking at. My dear students in this great school, your teachers, your friends, there's much work to do. Do not take the voluntary sector for granted. Let me tell you that this is virtually a unique feature of American society. We can claim a certain authorship to the strength of our volunteer society, of our independent sector. It's getting weakened now because of polarizations and wealth in America, because of kind of sourness, but because of conflicts between North and South that have not been resolved, between East and West, between industry and countryside. We have to deal with all these issues. But you people are on the right track. Bless you, and may it be a good Thanksgiving for all of us. Thank you.
Got time for a couple of quick questions. Yes, sir, Congressman.
Question number one, I'll just list them for you, and then you can respond any way you want. What is the problems to the world if conflicts remain unresolved, whether it's Eritrea, Ethiopia, Western Sahara, Cyprus, Turkey, Armenia? There's a perspective out there that says, well, they've been like that for several decades. What's the problem with them continuing? That's number one. Number two, you're talking about pain memory. Two questions to that. One of them is, it sometimes seems like the pain memory is felt stronger in the diaspora that have left the regions of the conflict than it is in the actual region themselves. Will you comment on that? And then when you talk about pain memory, unfortunately, old memories can have a way of being freshened up. Probably the best example is North Korea, South Korea, the incidents of the last 36 hours. which you had in the sinking of the ship, it's not just a memory from 60 years ago. It's been freshened up by new violence. How does that impact on your concept of pain memory?
Hard questions. I'm afraid that the first tendency that you're identifying of, we lived with these conflicts, there's even a name for it. It's called resilience. It's actually a movement, and I think it means something like stiff upper lip. And I'm afraid to say, since I seem to be on the mailing list of some of these organizations, and they seem to be coming from Israel, that there are a lot of retired army officers that did very well when they were invited to consult in all kinds of awful places on how to deal with terrorism, that are now hitting a new tendency, stiff upper lip. I was in fact invited to give a keynote talk at this resilience movement on Jewish history and resilience, on how the Jews have survived because they have stiff upper lips. And I absolutely refused, not only because I don't like this tendency, but because I thought it was absolutely wrong, that Jewish history does not confirm and legitimate this tendency that if there's a conflict here and there, we can outlive those guys. So this is a very bad development. I mean, sometimes, as my great teacher Hannah Arendt pointed out, one of the great peacemakers is exhaustion. People do get exhausted, and I think that's what's happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and great, let's build on that, and let's give them a different vision. But to say that somehow the independent world has the resources to outlive these kind of things is just not a good approach and should be argued against. In terms of pained memory, no, it's not only the pained memory of North and South Korea. It's also the provocations which it leads to, and it's also, now with North Korea, it's essentially starvation and perhaps a bit of chaos. In the wake of our work in China, there were some British members of Parliament and the House of Lords that were on their way to North Korea, and I've gotten several letters from them about how the situation in Korea is deteriorating, and that may mean that some North Korean government officials are, ready to say, let's call it quits, come in with more world aid or come in, and help us. It may mean that, South Korea's famous Ministry of Unity, which is a ministry of anti-unity, particularly if it comes to parity in currencies, like what happened in Germany, maybe they'll be able to do something, but I think that the situation is very, very dangerous, and I hope that there are wiser people. We have a wonderful ambassador, Ambassador King, who is the charge d'affaires on an ambassadorial level to North Korea issues, and I know that they're monitoring the situation carefully. I'm not sure what your first point about pain memory was. The diasporas, yeah. I became keenly aware of this during the Rwanda situation, where it was just such a horrible thing, and someone said to me, "Psst, follow the money." And indeed, if you follow the money, it generally goes to cafes in Brussels of a very smug emigres who are generally more right-wing than any of the participants whose bods are on the line. And this is almost a consistent factor across lots of conflicts. It's similar in the Israel situation, where the American Jews, big battalions of them, great heroes, are ready to take risks that Israelis who want to live normal lives are not prepared to do. And it's a very insidious thing. And insofar as many of them are Americans and we have some dialogue with, we should participate in that dialogue, but it is a pattern, and you're absolutely right. And the pain memory gets confused with pain guilt, with pain, why did I leave? Why did I defect the battle? Why am I not back there? You are absolutely right about that.
All right. Yes.
I understand your point about NGOs, et cetera, doing something for conciliation, but I wonder, why is it so difficult to get that message to the U.S. government? you know, you had Greg Mortensen and building schools in Afghanistan, et cetera, trying to get the word out. You know, this is a better way to go about it, but it just seems like nobody hears. We just spend the money on bombs and quick fixes, we think, which aren't so quick.
Well, people here, and USAID is behind a lot of the allocations of NGOs, but sometimes these decentralized efforts don't work out so well. I mean, I think that the whole phenomenon of NGOs should be examined, and I think that the Clinton School might be a good place for that research project. I think we should envision a career line for NGOs. I mean, one of the great anomalies of NGOs, and anyone who's been abroad and worked in these things, you know, we are siphoning off precisely the people who could be building, you know, democracy of these countries by, you know, paying salaries that are 3 times more than the prime minister. Any international conference that I go to and I see, you know, wonderful, wonderful people from places like Bangladesh. What did you used to be? Oh, I was the assistant minister of finance. What are you doing now? Oh, I am the director of the Mickey Mouse NGO because my children have to go to college. Now, this is an unanticipated consequence of our good intentions in a new instrument of policy that, you know, we haven't had time to examine carefully. There's a way of dealing with this, that, you know, we contract with people that, you know, to work in an NGO is a 10-year career, a 15-year career. You then then just at the moment when you're feeling burnout, which is usually what happens in these situations, we bring you to the Clinton School for a master's degree, or the Kennedy School, or, you know, or somewhere else. And part of that is how to duke it out in electoral politics. And we send you back and you go run for prime minister. You use your experiences to, you know, to really press for democracy or something like that. So there are lots of adjustments to these things. The idea of decentralizing, or, you know, the government filtering money through the independent sector is not a bad idea, but you know, we have to take responsibility for some of these unanticipated consequences.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give Dr. Levine a big round of applause.